She specializes in social semiotic multimodal analysis. She is interested in how people use resources such as gestures, face expression, sounds, speech, images, writing, and objects to make meaning of the world. She looks at sign and meaning making practices in place in face-to-face interaction in digital environments, which is close to our talks here, with a special attention to inter, cross, and transcultural communication. Elisabetta has a PhD from the University of Verona here in Italy. She spent a year on a special research program in London during her PhD studies with research on YouTube and mobile technologies. She's been part of numerous research projects on multimodal and narrative analysis, multimodal literacy, intercultural communication, super diversity, and etc. She's the editor of Visual Communication, and she's in the editorial board of Multimodal Communication and Kairos, Rhetoric, Technology and Pedagogy. She's also now the coordinator of pandemic, interaction and communication in the pandemic and beyond, a collaborative research project gathering academics and non-academics worldwide to develop an understanding of how social interaction and social communicative practices are changing during the pandemic. And this is going to be her focus today. Thank you very much, Elisabetta, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Marina, for inviting me. I must say, thank you for this very flattering introduction too. I must say, I'm very happy, excited, but honored and humbled of being here, and for Marina for inviting me here. Marina, who will always be Professor Bondi for me, because Marina has been the first linguist in English linguistics that I've listened to giving a talk back in 2006, when she was invited to the University of Verona to give a lecture to PhD students, and I had just enrolled in my PhD at that time, and I knew very little of English linguistics, and never would I have imagined that one day I'd be here giving a lecture, because Professor Bondi invited me to give a lecture to this wonderful summer school in digital humanities. And the fact that we call it summer school has also something to do with the topic of my presentation, the fact that the times and spaces and places of our communication and interactions have all shuffled up a little. So let me, again, thanks for the invitation. Let me just for a second share my screen. If you have any issues in seeing my screen at some point, because now I'll be sharing it, so I won't be able to see you anymore, just shout, give me a shout or something. So yes, I'll focus today on multimodality and the pandemic, and how multimodal analysis can help us understand what's happening to our social lives in the pandemic. Now, my talk is half a lecture and half a workshop, because the idea is that I'll ask you also to work and discuss together. So for the first part, I'll introduce some preliminary observations that we've gathered on changes in our communication and interaction practices because of the pandemic and the related policies that have been enforced. And then I'll ask you to work in groups if we manage to make the breakout rooms work. If not, we've got a backup plan to try and brainstorm and think about how, from these observations, anything that interests you in the observations that I mentioned, how these could be turned into research questions, and what type of methods and theories you could apply to what type of data to better understand these changes. So pay attention to my observations and try and pick one or two things that you're interested with or you disagree with, and start, because at the end, at halfway through of this 1 hour and a half, I'll ask you to start thinking about possible research questions. Now, as Marina said, I've started this collective initiative, PAMMIMIC, that's called Meaning Making of and that means Pandemic Meaning Making of Interaction and Communication. We've started it as a founding team with 30 colleagues internationally, colleagues in multimodal analysis. Each is based in a different country, and we cover all continents. I'm very happy about that. PAMMIMIC, it's a transmedia space, and I don't need to explain what transmediality means here, because that's one of the themes of this summer school, but it combines a website and different social media accounts together to involve both academics and non-academics, so common people or professionals of all kinds, in sharing observations and collaborating to pursue understanding of how the pandemic has changed communication practices and what this means for the future of social interaction. Overall, we've started mid-May, so everything's very, very preliminary at the moment, but we've managed in these 6 months now, to involve over 1,500 people across social media. And from the preliminary observations and sharing of this, of experiences, fears, and concerns and questions, we've gathered them, and we've published in end July a manifesto, making meaning in the COVID-19 pandemic and the future of social interaction, in Ben Rampton's working papers, and it's from that manifesto that I'll sketch. I'll try to map the changes in communication and social interaction practices. But before going there, because I said it's a team of multimodalists or multimodal analysts, let me go and give you a very quick introduction of multimodality. The first slide will be absolutely known stuff for you. I know multimodality is the combination of different semiotic modes or semiotic resources in a communicative artifact or event. It's the normal state of human communication, because monomodal communication almost never takes place, or it's rarer than multimodal. It's been taken up and developed by different theoretical perspectives, and I'll go through them in a minute. But all these perspectives stem and share four common assumptions. One, that all communication is multimodal, that the analysis focused solely or primarily on language cannot account for meaning as a whole. Each mode or semiotic resources has specific affordances, or let's say possibilities and limitations that come out from their materiality and the social histories, so how social groups, different social groups have developed them to fulfill their communicative needs. And then all modes concur together, each with a specific role to make meaning. So multimodal analysis pay particular attention to the relations, the meaning-making relations between the modes that are involved in any communication event or artifact. Someone's unmuted and should unmute themselves, because I can hear my thank you. So how you do multimodal analysis? It's analysis, so it's an analytical process. There are many ways, but let's say the commonalities is that you start analytically by identifying which modes are there in multimodal text, an artifact or a communication event. So you look at the resources for each mode, the modal resources in each mode, and the functional role that each mode plays in the overall representation. And then you start mapping the relation between modes, always in relation with the context. We never forget the context, obviously, and the meaning made by the relation in each mode is never the sum, but it's more the product of each component. It's generally fine-grained and qualitative type of analysis that's also kind of time and energy taking. So normally data sets are fairly small, but there have been attempts, and there are been attempts being undertaken to scope out and handle and manage larger corpora, specifically in the tradition of John Bateman at the University of Bremen, and I'll talk a bit later with that. The type of analysis traditionally the multimodal analysis does is a type of textual analysis. So you proceed normally through transcription, then description, then analysis and interpretation of what you see in a communicative artifact or an event. But it's also more and more often now integrative of other methods, such as ethnographic methods. More specifically, multimodal analysis then uses the traditional semiotic and linguistic methods for research. So it's mainly, and it started as being observational. You observe the multimodal text. You either observe the text, the disembodied text, like you would do in textual analysis, in critical discourse analysis, and in corpus analysis, or you observe the participants in a communicative event or how they manage texts. So like you would do in interaction and conversation analysis, but by video recording them, because you look at gestures and gaze and body proxemics too, etc. But you can also use multimodal analysis in ethnographic research through involving participants in the research, through interviews, focus groups and surveys, and carrying out tasks together with the participants. And it tends to be less logocentric, so that also in interviews or focus groups, participants often are asked or are elicited responses also by drawing or taking pictures or making videos, for example. And more often now, you do it in a mixed method type of approach. So you combine both methods. As I mentioned, there are many different theoretical perspectives through which multimodal analysis have been developed. I've listed here the ones that are, let's say, that belong to the field of study, multimodal studies. And I've pinpointed or sign-marked them through the main, let's say, milestone reference that started, at least for me, that type of theoretical perspective. If each of them has been developed a lot of researchers use integrated methods, picking from one framework and the other. If you are interested in more recent research on each of these methods, because you're interested in using one, feel free to email me after this talk in the future, and I'll be happy to start a dialogue with you and try and look for references too. So the first one I've mentioned here, which is also the one I use, but it's also the one that started using the term multimodality, is sociosemiotics. That, let's say, I'll mention in a couple of minutes the differences, let's say, between the different theoretical perspectives. Each has a different focus, and so has developed different tools that are needed to respond to that research interest. So sociosemiotics is more interested in what sign makers and meaning makers do, so in people's agency in relation to social structural conventions and practices. And so it looks at what single instances of sign making. And for social semiotics, you never use a sign, you always make a sign anew by using a semiotic resource and associating it to your meaning, depending on your interest. And so social semiotics is interested in analyzing representations made by people to derive how people position themselves, reshape power relations, but position themselves in relation to broader social phenomenon, to be able to derive broader social trends, or to see how the way we communicate, people communicate, relates to broader social dynamics in society. Systemic functional multimodal analysis, as the name says, it also started with Hallidayan linguistics, like social semiotics, and with Halliday's systemic functional grammar, systemic functional linguistics. But like the name says, it's more interested in structural and systematic analysis of structural regularities. So let's say if social semiotics is interested in how a person uses an image to make meaning and how that reveals their own positioning in relation to broader social contexts, systemic functional analysis instead is more interested in looking how images change their function in news websites, so in investigating patterns of regularities, let's say, and new emerging practices. Corpus-based, as I mentioned, the school started by the University of Bremen by John Bateman, aims to broaden, to manage larger corpora, and they're trying now also to use, because we know that with language you can handle it also with automated means, and they're trying now to use also video recognition to be able to analyze images or pre-analyze images automatically. Let's say that these three theoretical perspectives all started by looking at document-based analysis, or disembodied, as we would say, representations first, so image and writing, for example. But then they branched out also to look at forms of interaction, while mediated interaction, started by Sigrid Norris, and conversation analysis in its multimodal attention, so from Goodwin onwards, they instead started devising tools to analyze face-to-face interaction instead first. And then in some cases, they also poured into analyzing online interaction. So mediated interaction analysis from Sigrid Norris, who worked with Ron Scollin, looks at how the unit of analysis is action and how it's mediated through mediated tools or cultural tools, and that is semiotic resources. Conversation analysis, we know from conversation analysis analyzing speech, but from Goodwin onwards, there's been more of a holistic approach to how participants in an interaction co-construct meaning by using and managing gaze, gestures, proxemics, body orientation, and the handling of objects too. Then we have critical multimodal discourse analysis. I won't have to talk much about that, because if I'm sure you're all familiar with critical discourse analysis. The critical multimodal discourse analysis extends the notion of discourse and the critical investigation of discourse and how that shapes society and represents society and manipulates ways of representing, of portraying society, not only in writing and in speech, but in all multimodal resources. There's also a theoretical perspective that comes from the cognitive linguistic tradition, from cognitive metaphor, from Lakoff and Johnson's metaphors we live by, so to get a big reference that everyone will know. That's been started by Charles Forceville, and there's a growing number of scholars that look at multimodal metaphors and visual metaphors and metonymies and other forms of cognitive representations. And then finally, but not least, last but not least, last just in my list, is sorry for the pun, is geosemiotics, started by the Scollins, and that combines visual analysis developed by Kress and Verloven of signs in place, with an analysis of space and place, with an analysis of Goffman's interaction order. So they've brought some of interactional ethnography in it. That's, as I said, these are the theoretical perspectives that are more within what Kay O'Halloran called multimodal studies proper. But multimodality has been taken up by different disciplines and different other scholars outside, let's say, the community of what I would define multimodal analysis, because multimodality has been widely recognized as a phenomenon of communication. So, for example, linguists in the tradition of translanguaging are using a lot, are paying a lot of attention to multimodal resources in interaction and in translanguaging practices too. So this is not reductive of all. I don't mean to exclude all the others that do multimodal analysis. What I'm proud of is that all these theoretical perspectives are represented in the founding members of a PAMMIMIC, and I wanted that to be that as diverse as possible, precisely to bring different perspectives and different theoretical and research interests in it. Now, why, to get to the topic, why the pandemic, why communication and interaction matter in the pandemic? Understandably, research priorities in this pandemic have been others. They're focused on the virus itself, first of all, so in the health sciences, but also in economics, for the economic repercussions of the policies of the brought about by the pandemic, in the behavioral sciences and in crisis communication, to see how people would respond and react to messages on policies. And then there's also been a focus, especially among linguists, on how the virus has been represented and discourses about the virus and the pandemic. And Rodney Jones has set up a wonderful website, Viral Discourse, about that. But it's also true that the pandemic has unprecedented effects on the ways in which we regulate our social lives. I wouldn't be speaking to you from my house, not even my house, my partner's house, through this screen, if it hadn't been for the pandemic. In the way we interact with others face to face in our physical environments, in the way we interact with space, and also in the way we go about doing a lot of activities that have been digitally remediated online. And that's because of two needs that have brought about these big changes, two needs that, in spite of the diversity of what's happening in different places of the world and for different people, these two needs have been common and have affected all of us. One is to keep bodies apart because the virus hits the body. And the human body is the main medium for our relations with the world and with others. So when you keep bodies apart, communication and interaction practices have to change, but also the need of keeping people connected and keep social societies productive. And that's been unprecedented, thanks to an unprecedented system infrastructure for distance communication that we have now and we didn't have in previous decades. Now, for the character of the changes, one is pretty obvious. The changes have been global, in spite of the differences in different spaces, but the pace and level of the spread of the virus has been made this global character more perceptible and tangible. But it's also because the virus is one shared danger for all humans, and that's also one of the reasons why the war metaphor for this virus is not really good, because in a war, someone's enemy is someone else's ally, while this virus is a threat for everyone. And so that in spite of different local policies, the keeping bodies apart has been a common denominator, and that's been a global way that changes have impacted us in that sense. The perception of the global character of these changes is probably higher than in previous times, also because we have a live transnational information and communication system. This is obvious. And also we had increased mobility and transnational connectedness. Another characteristic of these changes is that they have been totalizing. They've been the focus of attention for months. Not only the virus, but also what we were doing and what we have been doing has been, so that people have called it an infodemics. It's been totalized communication and mass media, social media, but also in our private networks. I don't know about you, but I haven't been talking about anything else with the people I know for a good few months. But also in these months, it's been totalizing also because it's been characterized by huge uncertainty. It's a phenomenon that we didn't know. And so that we've been participating in a collective making sense of what was happening, a knowledge in the making. And that's a key point, I think, of why this is a particularly interesting, crucial moment to be researched and investigated. And finally, the character of the changes have been abrupt, and the changes have been abrupt and pervasive. Abrupt because of the urgency in the need of keeping bodies apart, because of the threat, and pervasive because they force to change our habitus in every minimal basic actions and movements, from what to touch, how to move in space when we go out, from how to start a work meeting or not, now that's been digitally remediated, and how to get out of it. So that the combinatory possibilities, as we said, we call this summer school, the time, spaces, places, activities, roles, media, and semiotic resources of our communication landscape have reshuffled. So to get a sense of these, to organize these observations that have been brought about in these months in the research initiative PAMIMIC, we've organized them according to the five key coordinates of changes: mediation, channels of perception, semiotic resources, meaning-making practices, and interaction order from government. And I thought of making them clear here now, because there might be useful coordinates or dimensions of communication that you might consider also in your own research. You might find them useful also to distinguish between media, modes, and senses, channels of perception, that sometimes the boundaries are fuzzy. They're all interconnected, but I think it's useful as heuristics to distinguish them, to handle data and reality. So let's start with mediation. Well, as a first, a lot of our social life has been digitally remediated. So the metaphor of the bubble that we once used for defining our personal networks in online environments have moved offline, have moved in the physical environments, have started to surround our bodies as a metaphor. So that while the physical world has been less accessible, has shrunk, and it's been newly regulated, the screens have become the windows to our world, our means of connectivity. If you consider, we've seen scenes of our own hometowns completely deserted in a way that we hadn't seen them before, just because our bodies as our medium was not there. And that's why they were deserted, and we could see them through our screens, through that. And that's in our physical world, our bodies and our intimate households, our social bubbles, need to be physically separated. But there's also reduced mobility, reduced social serendipity, the chance encounters with others and with strangers, and reduced contact. And I'll draw from contact in the next slide on the channels of perception, because in contact I'm using the stem tact that comes from tatto, touch. It's reduced because we can't touch people anymore outdoor. It's been varied and changing, though, and that's why it's also key to collect different perspectives. This digital remediation of social activities, which was already undergoing for many of us in some areas of activities like work, for example, it is however unprecedented in scope and in reach. In scope in the sense of the areas of our social lives that have been digitally remediated, and the spheres of life that have been digitally remediated, but also in the reach, because there's many more people now that participate in this digital remediation than before. And in that, the digital divide is becoming even more key in drawing thresholds in social inequalities. And by digital divide, I don't mean only access to technologies, which is key, but also in terms of digital literacy, and also in terms of having a physical environment in our households that allows for the digital remediation, for an ideal digital remediation. But going back to the reduced contact in the audiovisual, let's go to the channels of perception. The both online and outdoor. And if you've noticed, I tend to not to say online and offline, because online and offline, you can be offline and digitally mediated anyway. I'm talking about outdoor in our physical environments, outside the privacy, the safety of our house. But in both, there is a primacy now of auditory and visual channels of perception or senses. That's because touch, smell, taste are not safe anymore outdoor, and they are not online, they are not afforded anymore. Online, also the embodied co-presence is not afforded anymore, while offline the embodied co-presence is distant, so we need to resense it or reset our senses in perceiving that. In offline also, the visual, I would argue, has an even higher role than the audio, when the audio is muffled by masks, or at least the audio needs to be renegotiated. While in online, auditory and visual senses are the only one that are afforded now by digital technologies, at least for the moment, but also peripheral vision needs to be screened out. Because you need to focus on what you see on the screen and ignore what happens around you. All eyes are on everybody in multi-party interactions, including to yourself, so that it makes you quite self-conscious. It requires a lot of attention and energy. There's also, as I said, split attention between the screen and what happens offline. What happens in the physical environment, also the 360-degree hearing that we have as humans that we can use in our physical environments. Instead, when activities are digitally remediated, they need the 360 degrees screen sound hearing needs to be screened out, and we need to pay attention only to what comes out of the speakers. And the audio is heavily regulated online, as we know, in multi-party interactions. And then let's go to that. These reshuffling of channels of perception have consequences also on the semiotic resources that are afforded or that are more likely to be used, and in the way they are used. So again, both online and outdoor, gaze and gesture and body movement and proxemics are achieving new prominence and new meanings. Outdoor, when the face expression is hidden by the mask, many have commented on how they over-exaggerate their gazes when they want to signal smiling, for example, but they also gesture a lot, saying we're becoming all Italians, my English friends say, precisely because the audio is muffled by the mask. Body movements and proxemics have started to achieve new values in the way we move and we manage space with others, outdoor, but also online. And the re-regulation of sound and speech, as I mentioned earlier, is requiring different practices, both online and outdoor. And for this has huge consequences on the meaning-making practices that are emerging, they're not established yet. The thing is that a lot of the meaning-making practices that we would have established in the past are no longer viable, and new meaning-making practices are starting to arise. So by using visual input, we start planning, detecting body trajectories of others and planning our own body trajectories when we try to keep social distance when we are outdoors. So that I mentioned that it's a choreography of bodies outdoor. But how we move in space and in relation with others have become indexes, or maybe indexes, interpreted as indexes of levels of respect or disrespect towards others, and also on someone's stance towards the virus, whether they believe it or not, and identity. I mentioned silence there with an exclamation mark, because that's, I think, is significant, at least what I've observed here, about the fact that channels of perception do not deterministically determine the semiotic resources used, because we said auditory and visual channels of perceptions are prominent. So you would expect, by keeping our bodies apart when we are outdoor, that we would be louder with other people, so we would speak more loudly. But that hasn't been the case, at least in the UK, where I've lived, except for rituals, clapping for the NHS, or I know singing in Italy has been quite a big thing. But everyone's commented on how more silent it's been since the start of the pandemic outdoor, and that's because I think I believe, but it'd be interesting to investigate that being loud this brings the social values that we had from the past, from the before times, in terms of practices. Being loud was hardly acceptable in many contexts, or it was only assigned to certain demographics, with the others frowning upon that. In all of that, again, gazes and gestures have been much more prominent. But in the practices, we've already started noticing some reversed social values of signifiers compared to the past, so that coming close to someone or being distant from someone have reversed their meaning. While coming close to someone was a sign of intimacy, now it's becoming a threat, an invasion, a sign of disrespect, while being distant might have been a sign of being detached and cold, and now being distant has become a sign of respect. The same is for touch, but also things like turning your back. I don't know if it's ever happened to you, if you are in a narrow street where you can't keep social distance and you need to cross paths with others. If you turn your back, that in the past meant disrespect to someone, now is meant to be a sign of respect and care for the other and social responsibility. And that has meant that we need to renegotiate all the practices, so that a lot of people say that they need to meta comment, to make explicit what they're doing and how they're meaning what they're doing. And then there's new signs emerging, like the greetings. The elbow greeting is one of the many, while the reach of old ones is still with us, even if they're not viable. And there's new practices in the making also online, and many have commented of how much you wave when entering a meeting and going out of a meeting. We waved also here when I joined online. The use of chat and emojis, but also the backgrounds of people, please don't look too much at my background here, have starting to achieve new meanings. And there's been a lot of research on video interaction going on for a couple of decades now. But the fact is that there's an increased number of some makers now than earlier. So these new practices that are emerging are multiplying and fragmented in many different communities. And so it's really worth a crucial moment to investigate these. And finally, the interaction order. What we have been undergoing is a resetting, what Ben Rampton, in a comment on the Pandemic website back in May, mentioned as a resetting of the parameters of the interaction order. And I thought that's a really key sentence. The domains, what's separated and connected, are reshuffled again. The public and private spheres are undergoing a big change in many ways. They are undergoing a stark, marked separation in our physical environment, so that there is a threshold when we cross outdoors, the privacy and the safety of our houses, for those who are lucky enough to have a safe household, and when we go out. And this threshold has us reprogram our ways of thinking about practices that are no longer viable. So it's a threshold, and how to go about doing things when we cross that threshold in all actions and ways of interacting with others. So that threshold marks also a threshold between past and present, between past practices that we had familiarized that are still safe in the house, and then we have to switch to these new practices that are still emerging, that we are still co-constructing when we cross the door of our house. But inside our houses, there's been a merging of public and private, with public and private invading each other in our digital remediation of activities like the one that we're having here, so that every one of us has given access, but also has had access to private slices of other people's worlds and our own worlds, which we wouldn't have otherwise. And that includes celebrities, politicians, your bosses, etc. And that is generating a lot of puzzlement or disorientation, but also a moment where normativity is all up in the air. So that also the patterns of formality and informality have been reshuffled. You can see very beautified people participating in meetings along with very scruffy ones. And then you can see pets and partners walking out from the shower in official meetings in the background. And by formality and informality, I don't mean just signs, more explicit markers of formality and informality that we always think, but I brushed my teeth before starting this talk, and then I started thinking, why have I done that? While I'm still wearing my training trousers instead, big oversharing here. Anyway, and then this opens a lot of it's a really interesting time to observe. It opens also a lot of questions about privacy. And one question that I have personally is also what happens to all that crucial, fully confidential interactions that have a crucial role in our societies, such as corridor talks between politicians before a meeting, or between colleagues complaining about their employer and the working environment so that they might be starting taking actions, between students complaining about their university system or the course content and how it works. What happens to that when so many of the activities are digitally remediated and so potentially recordable and trackable? But also, well, and datafication, which was already taking place, as we know, but that now it has achieved an acceleration, but also increased calendarization of our activities, even for the activities that are more informal and for leisure. I was already surprised when I moved to the UK that you would have to make an appointment if you wanted to have a beer with a friend, but you still have spaces for social serendipity, for organic and spontaneous activities, unplanned activities. Now with the digital remediation, everything needs to be calendarized. So there are big questions about the big function of social serendipity, encountering others by chance and talking to strangers and interacting with strangers, but also about what the reach of our socializing and personal networks will be. A lot of people in pandemic shared on the Facebook group in pandemic, shared their concerns about, especially those who are single, but not only them, about not being able to meet new people anymore. And for this, we need to assess the gains and the losses, what's gained and what's lost in each of these changes, what adjustments and coping strategies people are making in place, putting into place, and what the implications for the future now. And it's key to research that now, before things have settled down, so that you can also voice your concerns and start to try and impact on the changes for the better. So, to sum up, this is a kind of a summing up slide. It's we've been undergoing, and it's a last point that I want to make. We've been undergoing all over the world in different ways, for different demographics. Obviously, it's a huge redisciplining process where unprecedented global, abrupt, totalizing, pervasive changes in mediation, in channels of perception, semiotic resources, meaning-making practices, and interaction order that's that's producing a reshuffling of the combinatory possibilities of our social lives. And that has meant that we've been redisciplining ourselves, and we are still redisciplining ourselves in how to carry out very basic actions, movements, and ways to go about to do things, so that the semiotic regimes no longer take hold that we had habituated and familiarized and naturalized. So these are starting to be denaturalizing. And that's invested all spheres, from work, leisure, parenting, caring, interpersonal, institutional relations. So that what was familiar before, what we had habituated, what we had naturalized before, is no longer viable. But there is no new familiar yet, or we haven't familiarized yet. We are still in the process of these emerging practices and co-constructing and negotiating these practices. Although we might now, after all these months, starting familiarizing or naturalizing certain practices. Just a couple of days, a week ago, I think it was the first time that I've realized that for the first time I stepped off the pavement when someone else was approaching the pavement to go on the road to keep social distance. And I've realized that only after I've done it. Instead, normally I would think about it. But in this redisciplining process phase that we are in is key to research, because when you have to rediscipline yourself, you are necessarily need to be aware. So you achieve awareness of the practices you had familiarized, and you start planning and thinking about how to reshape these practices. And so there's a diffused heightened awareness and a diffused meta-reflection. Everyone's been talking about it. Everyone's been reflecting about it, about to do things, about how things are different now, about what you can do and how to do, interact with others and communicate. So that we are in a key moment where there is distributed knowledge in the making. And that's why we wanted to involve also non-academics in this research initiative, to make the best of this distributed knowledge that is being made. And it's a key moment to observe the dynamics and the processes, how people create knowledge in the making and co-create practices in the making. And that's why there's the need to gather that now before we automate and naturalize new practices. So this is the last slide before we can start doing some group activity and group discussions. There is a lot to be known. I've noted here the main features of what I've mentioned that's interesting to be investigated. We need to think about what the implications are of keeping bodies apart from each other, of conceiving our social worlds as bubbles, and also if, you know, from the spring, the pandemic, the virus will be not a threat anymore. Let's all hope so. We can't pretend that a whole year of people reorganizing their practices will not have an effect for the future. What it means of reshaping activities as digitally, what it means that we have a primacy on the auditory and visual channels of perception, and the other senses are ruled out in many contexts, this reshuffling of private and public, but also this increased association of what of our intimate network as safe and stranger with danger, increased calendarization and datafication, but also the relation, what's the room of personal freedom and agency, and its relation with social responsibility and individual choices, in respect to individual choices, and as I said, social serendipity, and how this impacts different demographics, because we're not all the same in different places, and I don't mean just in different countries, but also rural and urban places, but also in people playing different roles in society. Also, what are the new trends, brand new trends? What are the accelerated ones and the ones that are a U-turn from the past? Looking at the accelerated ones is particularly interesting, like the digital remediation of activities, or the calendarization of the fewer opportunities for social serendipity, which were already taking place in certain contexts, but now they are accelerating. So there's more reasons to believe that they will stay, because it's just an acceleration. But then other practices have U-turned. For example, the primacy of the visual. In the 90s, scholars in media studies were talking about a visual turn. Now, in the last decades, scholars had started talking about a material and a sensory turn. And now that we are in a position where a lot of our senses are not safe anymore, what's happening with these turns? Are we U-turning from that? And one way to do that, as I mentioned, is using Günter Kress gains and losses to spot what the changes enable you to do and what enable less to do compared to the past, to see where the possible directions. But we need to look at that not only on the semiotic level, but the sensory, the cognitive, social, emotional, physical, political level, and to try to trace the possible implications for the future, but also to start collecting and sharing best practices. So this is it for now. If we have more time, I'll go through a little bit of what the first preliminary activities in Mimic in the last 5 minutes or so. But what I would like now to do is, if Vincenzo helps me, is if we can organize us in different, and I'll stop sharing. So I'd ask you to discuss in groups of 4 for 15 minutes, I would say, and to think about, from anything that interests you in the observations that I've presented, to think about possible research questions and how you would design a research to try to answer a research question on one of the many things that I've mentioned, or others that you might think. So start to think about what theories you would use, what method, and what data. And I would like you to do that while talking in a group. If you could post it on Padlet. I don't know if you know Padlet. I'll stop sharing and I'll send you a link in the chat to a Padlet that I've created. It's very intuitive to use. It's like a whiteboard, basically. And everyone can just click on it and a post-it will appear and you can just type on it. So that's it from me, and I would ask you to go in breakout rooms if Vincenzo does that, because I can't seem to be able to do that. And I'll see you in 15 minutes. Let's see if Vincenzo can do the breakout rooms. If not, we'll find another way. If not, I'll ask you to do it individually and post it on the board, and we'll discuss it. Vincenzo, can you? No? No groups? Well, then let's give it a, let's use this 15 minutes with each of you thinking about that and posting on Padlet. You've all seen in the chat, right? So you start with a research question that takes up one of the observations that I've mentioned, and then try and describe quickly with keywords how you would go about doing it, what method and what data you would use. And I'll pick from whatever you write there. Anyone's got questions on how to use Padlet? I'm using it a lot with my students and I find it quite good. Oh, there's someone who's already done. It's already starting. Obviously, if any one of you wants instead to talk and contribute in speech or has any questions in the meantime, we can use this minute also for that. Oh, what Federico is mentioning there is something that I haven't discussed about, because I focus more on our ways of interacting with others. But definitely, yes, the communication about the pandemic is definitely a big topic of investigation. I imagine there's been a lot of research that's been undertaken in that. There are research projects on touch, on that focus on single specific senses too, undergoing. There is a big crowdsourced project in cultural anthropology that's looking and trying to collect people's views and and feedback on their interactions, and obviously that overlaps a lot with the interests in panmimic. I think the semiotic take has a different has a different lens to interpret interactions in terms of meanings and resources and practices for representing meanings that can be useful or provide useful integrative insights to those that anthropology does. Anything else? What are the positive elements that could be taken and kept also when we will start to live with the virus? That's a really good question, Julia. Yes, and also the reduced mobility to about polluting the world. Yes. On the other hand, there's a lot of plastic being used because of PPEs, but also takeaway cups that were being reduced. But it's true. What are the positive elements too? And the positive or negative is also depending for whom and which point of view, right? Pandemic narratives screening during this crisis. So many narratives, yes. Our roles, how has computer-mediated classroom discourse changed the interaction and teaching learning? Yes, that's a big area of investigation too. There's the members in PAMIMIC, especially based in South America, are working a lot on that. And on this topic, they've launched a call for teachers, researchers, and students to send testimonies, pictures, and written reflections about the way the practice has changed by being remediated online. So you can join that if you want, because they are collecting testimonies for that. How is everyday shopping interaction affected? That's a really big question too. There's a project at the University of Odense, which Theo van Leuven participates, that looks at online shopping and that carries out a socio-semiotic analysis of online shopping. They got a big funding for that last year. And they were already looking at the differences of shopping online and shopping in physical environments, differences, but also the overlapping and similarities. And I imagine now how the shopping practices in physical environments might be changing increasingly more and more. And so that reopens questions about the shopping practices in the physical environments, not only in how we the online reshapes our perception and our experience of shopping. Yes, definitely. Coach potatoes as heroes. Oh, wow. Limits of humor in pandemic metaphors. Yes. Yes, the war metaphor, the hero metaphor, many other metaphors are there. Yeah, and it's a big, huge topic of investigation. Absolutely. and yes, also all the health practices too. In the UK, health visits now have been done online, and I'm really definitely interested in knowing from doctors and nurses how it feels to diagnose someone, to carry out a visit only through audiovisual means. And how that, yeah, and then obviously the health repercussions, the more material repercussions and social repercussions. Well, or there's more to what extent the newspapers tend too much text that is alter nowadays. Some of news value scholars such as Bednarek, as well as people involved in media studies, focused on in the last decades. That's a really on point question. Does this matching between images and linguistic items affect the way people objects are represented with the qualitative approach and the quantitative approach? Yes. Oh, that's a good one. Interactions on the job. I'm looking at this one at the back. How do the changes in proxemics and physical interaction, as well the presence of a mask, influence face-to-face job encounters? Yes. Ethnography, descriptive and inferential statistics. Survey to professionals, more detailed interviews, observation of actual meetings is possible. That is a really good thing. The selection of participants would be key here to get an idea of how, you know, the findings can, what the scope of validity of the findings are, depending on the participants that you select in which settings. Anything else? You're 70 attending and there's only 7 posted. That's why I would have done this. I would have liked very much to do this in groups. The humor in pandemic metaphors, there's a few researchers I know that are part of pandemic that are working on memes in the pandemic, and you know, memes have huge social roles, and they are representative of things that go on in society. We laugh at memes because we recognize ourselves in them. So they can, you know, analyzing memes, you can have a picture or some, yes, you can map in a sense things that go on in society, but also it is a reshaped picture of society, and memes in themselves and how they evolve have a key role. So, and the pandemic, I think, offers a really great chance to observe transnational dynamics. So if you want cultural specificities, but also sharedness transnationally. No one's mentioned that, but I think for me, for my research interest, that's the thing that has interests me the most, of grasping what's going on in this pandemic, precisely because it's global and it's so pervasive, that we have a unique opportunity to observe the dynamics provoked by one big event across the globe, and so the different dynamics of that we would call globalizing dynamics, the different dynamics of sharedness and differences because of different policies, but also of different cultural practices, but also of sharedness across the world. So I was surprised that we've signed this manifesto in 15, it was 12 of us, again, from different continents, including the Middle East, China, South America, and Europe, and North America, and Australia. And I was surprised at how much we all agreed about the observations that we were making. Although there were some specificities we mentioned that gaze, for example, is becoming so such a useful resource when we interact in physical environments, that my colleague from Oman said now people are starting gazing at each other cross gender in public, while gaze between the genders was stigmatized in society in Oman in the past. Now, if you want, I can see, is there someone else writing here? How do cultural, let's see, businesses communicate? Oh, museums during a pandemic? Yes. That is another big question about, again, digital remediation. A lot of museums have organized virtual visits, right? There's some research being done there. Sofia Diamantopoulou published an article in our website, Pandemic, on that. But that is a big question, yes. News discourses. Good. Oh, thank you for all these contributions. No. How can we save cinemas and theaters, arts in general? Yes. I'm not sure semioticians and linguists can save cinemas and theaters, but certainly we can investigate more on the practices and the values of the practices taking place there, but also on the different practices that are possible now together with artists. Comparative studies between East and West countries, interaction and communication rituals. That's another big topic. There haven't been in multimodal analysis, there have been since the 50s, since Stuart Hall, I would say, in anthropology and in linguistic ethnography. But those comparative cross-country studies, cross-cultural studies have also been criticized a lot for essentializing, for having skews in the methodologies, and essentializes national cultures, as if all members belonging to a national culture would behave the same as the participants that were observed. And so there's been a reshaping, I'm sure many of you will know that, of these cross-cultural studies in anthropology in recent decades that looks more at the dynamicity or how you perform culture, rather trying not to reify culture. But these, again, the pandemic would be a beautiful opportunity to do that, I would say. I'm more interested in commonalities than in transnational influences than differences, but without acknowledging that these differences are there, definitely. Good. Now we've finished. Oh, social media. How much have social networks influenced the narration of the pandemic and its main actors within the social interaction? This is a huge question, Elena, and I'd really like to start thinking about how to handle that. It's a big, big question, and normally it sounds like a question when you start a PhD. You come to your supervisor with this big question, and your supervisor will force you to narrow it down and narrow it down and narrow it down to be able to handle it. But definitely that is a big question, and we need to find ways to address it. So absolutely. Good. Okay, shall we stop here? If you want, I can share with you the rest of the few slides, but then I will open for questions if you're happy with that. I'll just share what we've done so far with Pandemic. That again, as I said, it's all at the very, very beginning. Because it's been 5 months now. But the idea is that at the start of the pandemic, everyone was talking about it, and I was thinking, well, what can a semiotician do? You know, everyone's acting as a semiotician, everyone's reflecting on it, and everything's constantly changing and so fragmented and multifaceted. How can we grasp that? Especially because in traditional research, data collection and times of analysis are very long, while I felt, maybe because I'm impulsive myself, I felt the need of grasping things while they were in the making, precisely because everyone was trying to has been trying to make sense in the process. And if you compare, and I've started thinking about that, about how knowledge is developed outside of academia. So in our everyday lives, how we develop knowledge that is not the specificity of our discipline is very different from how academia develops knowledge, right? We have long times with robust data to be able to analyze data and then publish findings. And we relate with what's outside academia as research participants or subjects or receivers, and then we tell them the results. While when we get to learn and construct knowledge in other areas of our life as everyday people, we do it in a live, public, dynamic, and relational way by talking to others, by looking at tips and tutorials and things that are online. So we do develop distributed knowledge that has a different process. And I wanted to be able to grasp that through panmimic and thinking, okay, let's start and create that. There are precedents for that, and I think, I'm sure you are familiar, you've heard about that in citizen science. That started in, that's the involvement of the public in scientific research. It started in the hard, natural, and life sciences. It's been ongoing for a good couple of centuries now, but it's also been approached in the social sciences and humanities. As I said, in anthropology, there's a project that crowdsources data on the pandemic, but also now Betsy Rimes, in particular Benson in Sweden, Betsy Rimes in the United States, University of Pennsylvania, have started a branch that's called Citizen Sociolinguistics. If you're not familiar with that, just have a read at Betsy Rimes and Andrea Leone Pitigala paper. It's fascinating. So you involve non-academics in the co-construction of knowledge. And that's what inspired panmimic. As I said, it's the finding theme is 30 people, but each of us involves other people in their networks. It combines academics and non-academics. The principles are that it's entirely voluntary. It's based on everyone's responsible for what they share. It's based on sharing and collaboration against competition, and everyone's recognized for what they share, so that everyone feels comfortable in sharing. No one's scared of being stolen their ideas. But it's also, we do it through live, open, public conversations by using the affordances of social media, so that they are traceable too, and we keep a record of these conversations. There's a website. The website is linked to social media. The social media account, we've got Weibo and WeChat in China, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. And now, no limits to the spheres of investigation. As I said, that we started with these observations as a first phase, and we are in this first phase. We invite people to share their reflections, their observations, their experiences, their fears, their questions, but also their best practices. And then we have other steps in mind, but we are not there yet, to try to develop methods for collecting and analyzing the experiences and the data shared, but also to agree collectively with others who have shared their experience on ways to conduct collective research in more structured ways than just the organic and spontaneous sharing of reflections, to try to derive implications for the future, the possibilities, the threats and the dangers, but also to start and provide indications on good practices and policies, and to try and shape forms of collective actions that try to impact towards positive change. Now, we're still at the first phase, and I'll present you what here the numbers. So in 5 months, up to mid-October, we've got now the month of November, we've involved over 1,500 people across all social media websites, published 26 articles, got comments, it's got nearly 30,000 visitors. The Facebook group that's been particularly active in these past months has nearly 1,000 members with 600 posts, 1,360 comments, and 9,000 reactions. The Facebook group has been quite active because we've involved our friends, and it's obviously a generational also issue, the fact that the Facebook group has been more active than others. Now, this table is the table that presents a thematic analysis, just a thematic, not a multimodal analysis, a thematic analysis of the themes of the posts shared on the Facebook group only in the first 2 months. And it's only in the first 2 months just because, I'm sorry, this semester has been so intense that I haven't had the time to carry out the thematic analysis of these future months. I will, I promise, during Christmas. But it can give you the idea of the breadth of the many themes that are connected, that pose questions about how we communicate and interact during the pandemic. As I said, the other steps, we haven't gone through those yet, but already that, so the reflections and the observations and the experiences shared, I think that they have a great potential for analysis because they enable us to observe how people, everyday people, including us, develop semiotic knowledge, co-produce and share semiotic knowledge in a moment where you need to reinvent practices. And I'm following Betsy Rimes in that, because for citizen sociolinguistics in Betsy Rimes, she looks at people that do talk about language. In her latest book that she's published, it's How We Talk About Language, and she treats that as acts of citizen sociolinguistics, because that's how we create shared knowledge about certain social values of how we use language. And it's the same for other semiotic practices, and this gives a unique opportunity to start this branch of research. So posts have been sharing requests for advice, links to sources, memes, a lot of memes, signage that they would grasp in their own environment, pictures of their own environment, but they've shared fears, but also observations, tips in the comments. People would give support, would provide different views, would share other links that could be useful, share personal experiences that would reinforce or counterbalance, but also thanks for others to giving tips and saying, oh, I'll use this then, and further observation. The thing that it's transnational is quite not unique, because it's not unique, but it gives the opportunity of many people to interact with each other across different countries, with people that they would know normally and that they've shared only, but that interest of observing how communication and their interaction practices are changed. I've got one example. I haven't brought it in full. The Facebook group is public anyway. I haven't brought it in full because I want to ask permission and the co-contribution of those who've posted it. But a friend of mine posted something about hugging and missing hugging others, and someone else posted about, oh, I tend to do this now. I approach someone by leaning my head to the back in between their scapulas. And I do that also with colleagues, and they seem to appreciate that. Someone else posted that, say, oh, I've done that. I call that the backpack hug. And then another 30 comments came one after the other there. We all started calling that the backpack hug, with someone saying, oh, I'm going to use it. I'm going to do that. So that gives you a glimpse of how semiotic knowledge in the making can be co-produced and shared by others. Even if in a minimum, post and comments, you can have a glimpse on observing of how we co-construct knowledge about semiotic practices. And I think I'll stop here, inviting all of you no one's a young scholar, too young scholar to do that. No one is a too senior scholar to do that, to contribute, to give us indications or to contribute with ideas on how we can go on to do the other steps in there. And that's it. So you can join, and these are the references, but I'm happy to share the slides with you if you think they're useful. So I'm done. I've left 10 minutes.
Let me, yes, let me open perhaps the time for questions. I'm sure that people will appreciate the slides, and there's a number of questions. Well, the first perhaps, well, you've in a way you've already answered, but I'll read it from Federico. Thank you for your extremely interesting seminar. You mentioned before, I hope I've understood it correctly, that you're taking part in a project dealing with communication and the pandemics. That was during the activities. I'm curious about finding further information about how it's developing. Are there any public links to it? You've mentioned, you've shown something. In case negative answer, when will the results be out?
Well, Federico, you can join us. You can become a mimic, definitely. You can contact me and I'll involve you if you've got ideas, but definitely, yes, there's the link to the website, and I have it in there in the slides too.
Okay, and there's another question from Erandi. Thank you very much for delivering this webinar and sharing your knowledge with us. If I may ask about something that's kind of unrelated to the current theme, I was wondering whether I could get some input on the framework of website interactivity that you proposed in 2014.
Well, thank you, Randy. I'm really happy that you read my framework. You know, as academics, we never know. We write, and we never know if anybody will ever read us. So, yes, definitely. If you want, you can contact me on an email, and we can start to chat about it if you have specific questions or if you want to test it. Yes.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Well, lots of thank you.
So I'm writing my email here for everyone who wants to contact me and wants to know anything more on this. Oh,
lots of people thanking you.
That is another thing that, you know, it makes me reflect. I've noticed also with my students in class. I don't know if if it happens there in Modena, Reggio Emilia too, that normally when we finish lectures, you know, in a classroom, in a physical classroom, people would just go away. They would look at you, maybe smile at you, or avoid looking at you and go away. And now instead, my students online, at the end of class, a lot of students would write thank you in the chat, which is similar again to the waving that you wouldn't bother doing, you know, when you get into a physical environment. And instead, because it looks abrupt, and I think it's because you perceive the separation, the disembodiment of the experience, and you feel that you need to give. And that is something I like, frankly.
Yeah, and at the same time, if I can add that, there's a disembodiment, but there's a sort of, it's like more one-to-one. So people feel the need to be, because after all, what they see on the screen is probably your slides and your little face all through the talk.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. You've got fewer distractions in that. Yeah, no, it's true.
There's a number of things that, yes, that may
yeah.
be, typical of this kind of communication, which may also sort of develop further during this pandemic.
Yes.
Like, for example, the the private-public hybridity that you mentioned, that's typical of a lot of digital communication, but certainly during the pandemic has become
Ouch, potato, of course.
Yes, most definitely as enhanced, or more for everybody. Yeah, dealing with everybody. Yes, it's true. It's true. There are also the positives that someone mentioned in the Padlet, just because we've got still 5 minutes. There are positives, like, again, I wouldn't be able to speak here, you know, or I've had the chance to give talks in China, and we've had the chance now to organize seminars with speakers that otherwise we wouldn't have the chance, and also to attend events, but also in leisure time, gigs, concerts, etc., in a different format, obviously. And you have a nostalgia, you miss the physical interaction that you used to do there, but you get the chance to participate in events that otherwise you wouldn't, because of the online medium. So yes, there are positives too, most definitely.
Yes,
there are, no, you go.
Wider opportunities, but yes, but what you miss, certainly one of the things that you've mentioned quite a lot, and I think it's part of academic life in particular, you miss the sort of serendipity, social elements, because everything's structured, everything's planned. After all, once you open a channel, you can say you can go on, but you've decided to talk and you've given yourself a topic and you've given a structure to the event. You may be overlapping, as I'm doing, but you've given yourself a structure.
Absolutely. I remember in 2010 when I did a research on mobile phones together with Gunter Kress, and the mobile phones the smartphones had just been introduced, and they gave me a smartphone because we were writing a book together. They gave me a smartphone. They said, try it out and see how, make a semiotic analysis of that. And I remember me seeing the feature of the maps for the first time, and started through the analysis. I had already mentioned the concern that this thing would diminish the chances of interacting with strangers. With the maps, with having the information available on our phones, it's less likely that you are forced to ask to a stranger for information and directions. And so approaching someone, a stranger, will become a potential threat more and more. Already from there, now with this thing that anyone is a potential danger for you, any other body that doesn't live in your bubble is a potential stranger for you. That's my main concern, I must say, because that, inserting itself within, also racist, neo-nativist discourses that are going in the contemporary political environment, it's really concerning about the possibility for social texture that don't include the immediate people that and you already trust.
Yeah, true.
And that is one of my main concerns.
Yeah, so there'll probably be a lot of need for retexturing.
Yes, retexturing is a good word. It is a really great term. I'll use it. Thank you, Marina. Retexturing. Yes.
And I would add another observation, if it is possible. Also, the way we give new definitions, or we use new terms. For example, when the over tendency to use social distancing, whereas it is physical distancing, and nowadays it is acquired through the common lexicon as a social distancing, and so we are conceptualizing something very specific about the social attitudes, which is, in my opinion, it is dangerous to acquire this practice. And nevertheless, and furthermore, there's also the tendency to acquire lexis which is not actually what it means. For example, in Italy, we have the tendency to use smart work, which it is in Italian, it is telelavoro, and it is something completely different from what smart work originally meant. So retextualizing would also imply researching on these issues as well.
Re-signifying, yes, you're absolutely right. And funnily enough, social distance was the technical term, you know, it was the academic term developed by, as we know, you know, Edward Hall to define the distance of acquaintances that were not family, and you know, the distance that people would behave as opposed to public distance and personal distance. So when it was introduced in communication for this pandemic, in communication policies and crisis communication, it was taken from the discipline to mean you have to keep a social distance. So you have to avoid personal distance to keep a social distance. But then it's been verbalized, like everything in English, so it's become social distancing. And so you have to distance socially, distance from society, and that resignifies completely. And so there's very little that academics can say to tell people, no, but social distance means that and not that, because the meaning association of you need to distance socially has all its impact, like the meaning association of smart working, as if it was smarter to work on the screen than it was, you know. Absolutely, you are absolutely right.
Okay. Yes. If there are no other questions, I'll just repeat that there's lots of people thanking you and asking for the slides, if we can have them. And we thank you very, very much for all the input you've given us, and we look forward to seeing you, hopefully in Modena, hopefully when in person.
It'd be nice to hug you.
Yes, and it will be a great update on how your study goes on.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, and good luck to all the PhD students and researchers there and your projects.
Thank you.
Unmissable waving. Bye-bye.
Thank you. See everyone.